One trigger, one road, and everything changed. Imagine the world held its breath in gray winter light, while a single pair of gloved hands hovered near a trigger. The Ardennes that December felt less like a place and more like a test. Skeletal trees like witness sticks, snow falling sideways under a wind that cut like a blade. Inside an M10 Wolverine cold fogged a periscope, and a young gunner counted the seconds between his shivers. He was alone enough for the details to matter. The way breath fogged the lens, the tiny scrape of metal when his glove brushed the elevation dial, the notebook page in his pocket with diagrams that read like a math problem for violence. Outside, a German armored column threaded a narrow forest road, like a serpent that didn't notice a single tooth could stop it. That road mattered because it led to a crossroads that fed supply lines and reinforcements. If that road fell to the enemy, men would starve. Units would be trapped, and a whole front could shift on a single decision. This is the moment where rules and reality start to pull in opposite directions, and what follows will ask the viewer to decide whether obedience always equals safety. But the rest of the story is stranger than a simple choice. Inside the Wolverine, the scene was microscopic and enormous all at once. The periscope fogged, the metal smelled of cordite and grease, and the gunner's fingers answered the cold with a tremor that looked like fear but had the geometry of someone used to angles. He watched through a lens that turned distance into diagrams, tracks cut into snow, tire lines that marked where treads had chewed the earth, the faint shine of metal through brand. He recorded range, bearing, the speed of the wind, and little numbers in a small spiral book he carried like a private ledger. Those numbers were not obsession so much as preparation. The man wasn't recklessly itching to shoot. He was building a proof. Being inside that turret meant being close enough to feel the shudder of each vehicle's engine, but far enough that commands came through broken waves on a radio that crackled like static in an old photograph. The protocol was simple and brutal. Wait for orders. Don't give away your position. Avoid friendly fire. Yet there is a violence to waiting too. The slow accumulation of knowledge, the sense that inaction can be worse than action. He watched, and he calculated, and by the time the lead of the column slid into the valley, his notebook had the answer he needed. The choice he made next would not be about thrill or glory. It would be a calculation built from cold observation. The column moved, and with its frictions of arrival, the column itself looked like a lesson in formation discipline. A tiger lumbering at the head like a battering ram, Panzer IV's close behind, half-tracks clustered beneath the canopy, and fuel trucks tucked into the rear like vulnerable hearts. When armored units travel a narrow road boxed by forest, their power can become their weakness. There's no room to splay out, no ability to wheel away, and the very order that keeps them efficient makes them fragile. From the ridge, the road was a trap hemmed by trees whose branches hid movement and whose banks blocked escape. Every vehicle had a role, every role had a risk. The tiger at the head could plow forward through open country, but inside a choked lane it was almost blind to its sides. Fuel and ammo lived in the rear, where one hit could cascade into catastrophe. A handful of well-placed rounds could not merely disable a few trucks. They could turn organization into chaos, create a physical choke point, and convert momentum into paralysis. That is the kind of geometry that a quiet man with a notebook could read like a map of dominoes. The danger was not just the enemy ahead, it was the balance between waiting for permission and acting while the window stayed open. And orders were rigid because fear of friendly fire was a real, terrible thing. The command line forbade any engagement without confirmation. The tension, obey to survive or disobey to save, tightened with every creak of the hull. The military's rule to wait didn't exist to be cruel. It was a rational answer to the chaos of a battlefield where radios fail, messages are lost, and mistaken identity kills your own. Units had been shredded by friendly fire, and commanders were forced to be conservative because the cost of one wrong shot could be dozens of lives. That rule sat in a cold farmhouse 3 days earlier when a captain read the line aloud, and men nodded with the practiced quiet of soldiers. But rules are paper until the moment they meet a live option. The gunner in that turret knew every reason the order existed. He also knew the math of the column, where it would be exposed, where a single disruption would ripple outward, and how a formation's discipline could be used against itself. Waiting became not caution, but potential catastrophe. Every minute the column crawled, the chance of it reaching the crossroads increased. He had watched a lone panzer slip by his sight 3 days before. He knew what patience could cost when a road mattered more than obedience. The problem with orders is that they assume the world will wait for you to obey. Sometimes it doesn't, so the gunner counted, the radio failed, and he made the kind of choice no manual could fully endorse. The weight of that decision is the hinge that will either swing the road to disaster or hold it for those who needed it most. Who fires the gun when a manual says not to? For this story, the man in the turret came from a place that taught angles the way other kids learned songs, wide Kansas plains where the wind peeled layers off barns and math was practical. He wasn't a soldier hungry for battle. He joined in 1942 for training and a shot at a future. Before the war, he spent afternoons in a small engine shop learning about gears, torque, and leverage. Practical lessons that translated oddly well to a battlefield. In Normandy, he learned another kind of calculus. He watched how turrets turned, how long it took a loader to ram the next round, and where a crew was most vulnerable during ignition and reload. He sketched vehicles and notes into a spiral pad he kept in his jacket, training his eye to see where a punch would hurt most. That habit, quiet, a little obsessive, became the difference between someone who followed orders and someone who could invent a solution when wires went dead. That habit, quiet, a little obsessive, became the difference between someone who followed orders and someone who could invent a solution when wires went dead. He carried not bravado, but a set of rules born from observation. Move after each shot. Keep the angle unpredictable. Aim for structural collapse rather than brute force. That background turned him into the kind of practitioner who translated mechanical knowledge into battlefield strategy, and it's why a man from Kansas could sit inside a steel hull and think like a chess player facing a column of pawns that didn't know they were set to fall. His past didn't make the choice right by command, but it made the choice intelligible by necessity. It's a small human detail that explains how a careful calculator became a reluctant breaker of rules. Patterns are a weapon. He had studied the enemy's movement until the machines became rhythm and path instead of anonymous metal. Tank columns aren't random. They repeat doctrine. Armor first, infantry tucked behind, fuel and support trailing. A formation built on reliance becomes predictable, and predictability is exploitable. He observed how the Tigers pivoted their turrets, how panzer crews handled reverse, how a half-track hesitated when the lane clogged. He knew where to strike, not because he wanted to show off, but because hitting the right vehicle in the right order could trap the entire column. That's the logic behind the term he scribbled in his notebook later: controlled collapse. Pull a strategic stone from a wall, and the rest falls in a designed way. It reads clinical, almost cold, but the calculus is simple in its cruelty. Remove the connectors and the machine stops functioning as a machine. It's a tactic that relies more on comprehension than on brute force. He had practiced shifting position after every 2 shots to create doubt. Smoke and fog would amplify the illusion of depth and numbers. In his mind, each shot was a step in a pattern designed to induce panic and cause the enemy to misread the battlefield, to invent threats where none existed. The elegance of the plan was that it turned the enemy's strengths, discipline, tight formations, into the very weaknesses that would break them. That pattern would prove devastating, and in the confusion that followed, almost unimaginable. He did not fire at the lead, he chose the third vehicle. There's a reason for that. Take out a lead tank, and the rest can sometimes push through or respond with concentrated force. Hit a middle vehicle and you create a jam, cripple the right support, and you expose fuel or ammo to fire. The first shell left the M10's barrel and struck the flank of a Panzer I, detonating with a force that threw snow and metal into the air and froze time for the men watching through scopes and windows. The second was aimed at where the column's anatomy left it most vulnerable, a half-track with infantry and fuel nearby. That hit turned order into flames. Every hit was deliberate, surgical. Each shell wore the pattern of someone who had practiced the equations in his head. He moved his position slightly after each sequence. 10 yards here, 20 there. So muzzle flashes couldn't be easily triangulated. In the trees, the Germans began to think their enemy was larger than truth. Smoke, sound, and shifting fire rates created an impression of batteries firing from multiple angles. But the reality was the opposite. A single gunner who had decided the mathematics of collapse were worth more than a lost radio. Each strike magnified the last explosions reflected off trunks. Frightened men scattered, and the narrow lane became a landscape of wreckage. This is the moment where precision becomes myth, a single sequence of well-placed shots, turning calculation into legend in the minds of those who survived. The immediate result was chaos, and chaos had a momentum of its own. The panic that followed was not just about burning metal, it was about perception. When infantry fled into trees and commanders saw multiple flashes in different places, their minds supplied whole batteries to justify the sensory evidence. Prisoners later described attacks from multiple directions. One young man swore he saw muzzle flashes from 3 angles. Those testimonies weren't lies. They were the brain's attempt to make coherent the incoherent. In the smoke and shock, the Germans invented what their training said should be present: a full battery supporting units and an ambush organized by numbers. But the truth was a single M10 moving between positions and firing with a rhythm chosen to maximize confusion and minimize exposure. The psychological effect of that confusion cannot be overstated. Fear fills in blanks and converts noise into structure. A single disciplined action by one crew convinced entire units they had stumbled into an orchestrated ambush. That misperception bought time and space for American forces to move and for the road to remain contested rather than surrendered. Perception became force multiplier. Panic spread faster than artillery. The result on the ground looked like a larger operation because human psychology had been used as a force, and once some soldiers believed they were surrounded by many guns, resistance collapsed in ways a single weapon could not have achieved by firepower alone. It's a lesson in how the mind can be turned into a tactical variable. When the shooting stopped and the smoke thinned, the battlefield looked more like the aftermath of an airstrike than a solo engagement. Buffaloed frames, twisted tracks, and blackened corpses littered the road. The wreckage stacked like dominoes where ordered movement had been interrupted and then frozen. When American scouts reached the site hours later, they expected to find a coordinated assault. What they found instead was the evidence of a surgical disruption that produced the same effect. There were no American dead. That absence raised a different kind of question, not how many were lost, but how the result had been achieved with so few resources. The gunner and his crew returned to camp under a different kind of weight. Relief that their action had helped and dread that official channels would now demand explanation. Reports were filed, sketches compared to the terrain, and radio logs were searched for confirmation. The men waited for a reprimand or a court. Martial because the military is built on order, and not everyone gets to decide to break it. Yet when commanders looked at the strategic outcome, supplies flowing again, a crucial road held, a paratrooper division relieved, the mood shifted. In place of punishment came a tense curiosity. The questions officers asked weren't just about discipline. They were about whether a method could be taught, whether doctrine could absorb what appeared to be disobedience and relabel it as innovation. The aftermath wasn't clean or tidy, it was a moral and tactical paradox that would ripple into training rooms for years. Instead of being dragged before a court, his notes and diagrams were read and then quietly distributed. Officers who could have punished him began to see the value in his approach. The idea that you could use the enemy's own formation rules to set a trap by design rather than by brute force. He was asked to diagram his thinking, and the military took those diagrams seriously enough to send them to artillery schools for study. The phrase controlled collapse, the deliberate removal of specific elements to make a formation fail, started as a scribble and became a concept taught under different names in training manuals. This is where the paradox becomes literal. A man who disobeyed orders was not only spared but asked to teach others. Doctrine, after all, grows out of success as much as it grows out of theory. What had been insubordination in one context was innovation in another. The military learned from the result, even if they could not officially endorse the way it had been achieved under fire. Over the following years, the principle migrated into Cold War doctrine and training scenarios where selective targeting and formation disruption mattered in a different strategic calculus. The man who pulled the trigger for a single minute didn't seek glory, he wanted to save lives and a road. The Army, pragmatic and often secretive, could set aside strictures to adapt to a lesson that saved lives in practice. Life after the war for him was quietly ordinary. The man who had sat in that turret returned to Kansas married and opened a small repair shop where engines and grain silos replaced conversations about strategy. He fixed tractors, taught his son geometry in the dust, and lived a life that looked nothing like the stories told in barracks and classrooms. He never posed for pictures or wrote memoirs. His contribution entered doctrine without fanfare. When a historian decades later found a faded after-action report in a cardboard box and tracked him down, the answer he gave was simple and human: the trees, the cold, the moment before the first shot. He didn't frame himself as a hero. Heroes were loud and public, but what he did had been quiet and necessary. His explanation was not rhetorical, it was practical. The radio would have come too late. He lived with the knowledge that his choice could have been punished or praised, and that reality carried a weight that doesn't fit neatly into labels. His life after war is the kind of epilogue that reminds viewers how big events sometimes pivot on small private acts and how the people behind them often want only a quiet life afterward. We end with a tension between legend and record. Accounts vary, eyewitness memories blur under the stress of survival, and military files sometimes bury oddities under red tape. Some veterans and prisoners described a multi-unit ambush. Others remembered flashes from different angles. The historian who dug out the report found diagrams and language that suggested method rather than miracle, but names were thin in the official pages. The term the survivors used, the ghost battery, is as much a reflection of what fear creates as it is a label for what happened. So when we tell this story, we treat specific details with care. Where records are unclear or names unverified, we say so. We call it an account, a study, a case that was used quietly and later adapted into training. But we don't claim every line in the small notebook was scripture. The lesson, regardless of whether the particular man's name always appears in the archives, is about choice, timing, and the uncomfortable fact that rules can be both life-saving and life-threatening, depending on context. If you want the diagrams and a breakdown of the firing sequence I used to map this, comment diagram below, and I'll link the visuals and citations for the curious. One gunner didn't win the war, but a single minute of decisive calculation held a road, and for some, kept lives from freezing out in the snow.